Shana Tova, everyone. My middle son is a huge fan of all things Marvel. So when he learned that the latest Spider-Man movie was going to be re-released into theaters, he became very excited. My son told me that the new cut of this movie was only going to be out for a limited time. It would contain 11 minutes of previously unseen footage. It was going to be shown in Dolby, meaning the screen would be enormous, the graphics would be sharp, and the sound would be crisp. In other words, my son explained, Dad, it's gonna be sick. And because this movie was going to be sick, we quickly went online and purchased tickets before they sold out. A few weeks ago, the day of the big show came. I packed a bag filled with popcorn and other junk food contraband, and off we went to the theater. When we arrived, I was expecting crowds, lines, and a rush, but we walked right on in, sat in our reserved seats, and waited, hoping that despite the anticipated crowd, we might have an extra seat next to one of us where we could place our smuggled snacks. I spent the next few minutes talking to my son until the lights faded, the theater grew dark, and I realized there was no one else there. At the time, I thought that the sparse crowd was an anomaly. After all, the movie we saw was a re-release, and maybe people weren't as passionate about our favorite neighborhood Spider-Man as my son. But the other week, I came across an article in the New York Times claiming that people just don't go to the movies like they used to. Even if the pandemic wasn't an issue, as streaming services offer incredible program selection, and enormous TVs are available for very affordable prices, more and more people prefer to watch the silver screen on their own screen at home. Movie executives estimate that in order for their industry to be profitable, at least 5,000 of the 45,000 theaters across the country should close. Movie theaters aren't the only contracting community space. Starbucks recently announced plans to close over 400 of their traditional locations, opting instead to open more drive-thrus and grab-and-goes. Even locally, in Encino, the very popular California Chicken Cafe, you can no longer eat in the restaurant, it's takeout only. These developments are not exclusively the result of COVID. Our withdrawal from public spaces has been occurring for some time. There are hardly any more public pools in our towns. Bowling alleys are closing. We do our research on private screens instead of at the library. And now the movies and Starbucks. Our lives have gradually privatized, moving inward to more controlled settings where we dictate who we meet and the terms on which we meet them. In an age of individualism, we are free to live life as we choose, but with alarming frequency, we are choosing to live apart from one another. Let me explain why this concerns me. A few years ago at my prior synagogue, we held a pop-up rabbi event at a local Starbucks. A man saw the sign, pop-up rabbi, and he asked if he could sit for a few minutes. I got him a cup of coffee and we began to talk. Turns out that this man was a pastor at one of the local evangelical churches. He told me that he had a big sermon coming up, and I shared that I was preparing my high holiday addresses as well. So we decided to share with one another. We traded laptops and began to read each other's work. After we both finished, there was this awkward pause until we both laughed. The one thing that we both agreed on is that we pretty much disagreed with every word of the other sermon. For a few months after our chance encounter, we kept in touch. We shared our writings and even enjoyed a few laughs over lunch one day. I like to think that this time with this pastor was a blessing, a source of goodness. Unfortunately, with fewer and fewer public spaces to come together, these kind of chance encounters are becoming far less likely. Business consultant Alan Gregerman thought about this trend as well. Earlier in his life, he used to warn his school-aged daughter, "Don't talk to strangers." Then he reconsidered his fatherly advice in a book he wrote entitled The Necessity of Strangers. Here's what he says. What if strangers, in many ways, are more important than friends, more important to our growth as individuals, more essential to the success of our companies and organizations, and more critical to the prosperity of our nations and the stability of the world that we share with 7 billion other strangers? And what if, in order to succeed in anything worth doing, we must engage, learn from, and collaborate with people we don't know? According to Gregerman, there is no stranger danger. The real danger is when we get lost in ourselves. That's the central message of the book of Jonah, which we're going to read in the concluding hours of Yom Kippur. In the book, so much that Jonah does is just wrong. No wonder the whale spits him out. Yet a prophet's job is to deliver a message that makes people change, and Jonah is remarkably successful at this. After getting spit out by the whale, remember, Jonah goes to Nineveh. He delivers God's message to the people, telling them to repent for their sins. Now, most of the time in the Bible, prophets, they're like parents. They need to repeat their message over and over and over again. But not here. The people of Nineveh listen to Jonah, and they change. But here, at the very end of the book, it takes a dark turn. Instead of rejoicing or even simply appreciating his success at catalyzing this remarkable change, Jonah leaves the city angry, sits all alone under a bush, and begs to die. After all he went through, Jonah feels aggrieved that God shows compassion and mercy to the city. In a way, Jonah is the most successful prophet in that the message that he brings instigates real change. But in so many other ways, the sulking Jonah, disconnected and self-concerned, is an example of how not to live. By reading Jonah as Yom Kippur comes to a close, the tradition is calling out to us. We may spend the day of Yom Kippur in reflective solitude, but that's no way to live throughout the year. I'm growing concerned that more and more we are becoming like Jonah, stewing in our social media silos, looking at screens instead of one another, with little exposure to people outside our own carefully curated comfort zones. And as the public square continues to shrink, there are precious few places where strangers can overcome our Jonah-like isolationist tendencies and discover the beauty of one another's souls. The loss of space where we can come together comes at an enormous cost. According to Ezra Klein, in his book, Why We Are Polarized, over the past 50 years, our country has self-segregated. Where we live, where we socialize, the media that we consume, and even the spaces we occupy online. As a result of living in ideological echo chambers, both left and right have not only moved further away from one another politically, but where we really have moved is how we feel about one another emotionally. Our disagreements over issues have metastasized into hatred for one another. In the past several months alone, both the Washington Post and the Guardian published extensive pieces analyzing the chances of civil war in America. That the idea of a new civil war can even be raised by serious publications, it's a clarion call to us all. As we pull inward away from one another, with fewer places to come together, the fabric of our society is tearing apart. And therefore, perhaps now more than ever, we cannot get lost in the sweet celebration of the new year while ignoring the shofar's call to action. This year is a reckoning for us all. Unless we begin to meet one another, stepping out of our stranger danger protected social silos and ideological echo chambers, disagreements in our head will continue to become hatred in our hearts. And if we continue to sit alone, stewing in our self-righteousness like Jonah, our society will not thrive like Nineveh. It will burn like Sodom. I want to share a story about moral development to illustrate my point. It's a study. Participants in the study were asked to consider the following moral dilemma. Should a poor husband steal medicine from a doctor to save his sick wife's life? In analyzing the situation, one child, an 11-year-old boy, reasons that human life is more valuable than money. The doctor probably would not be ruined by the loss of medicine, and something can be illegal without being unethical. With this in mind, the boy ultimately decides the husband should steal the medicine. According to the case study and conventional thought, this boy had achieved a level of moral maturity. The same situation was presented to another participant in the study, an 11-year-old girl, who processed the scenario very differently. The girl did not want the wife to die and thought that something needed to be done. So she suggested that the husband should speak to the doctor, maybe try and arrange a loan or ask other people for help. Besides, the girl reasoned, if the medicine was stolen, the husband could be arrested and tossed in jail. That would make the wife even more ill. The girl hoped to keep the husband and wife connected. And she even saw a connection with the doctor as a possibility. So no, according to the girl, the husband should not steal the medicine. The girl's moral judgment in the study was deemed a full stage lower in maturity than the boy's. That is, until Carol Gilligan came along. Remarking on the study, the psychologist and ethicist Gilligan said that the boy, he's only more mature if we look at the scenario as a math problem where one needs to find the greater good or the lesser of two evils. But the girl, Gilligan writes, she sees the situation not as a math problem, but as an opportunity to foster connection. For the girl, the challenge can be overcome by connecting and relating instead of prioritizing and choosing. Gilligan writes, seen in this light, the girl's understanding of morality as arising from the recognition of relationship, its compelling representation seems far from naive or cognitively immature. Instead of resigning ourselves to lives of division, inspired by Carol Gilligan, we can all claim the moral high ground by seeking common denominators and connections with one another. Nineveh thrived despite Jonah's seclusion, but our society cannot weather the storm of social solitary confinement. Interestingly, the Hebrew name for synagogue has nothing to do with prayer. A synagogue is called a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering, because by gathering together, we connect with one another. And connecting with one another is how we build connections with God. This is why assuring people who believe differently about the most fundamental issues, people who vote differently, who practice Judaism differently, who act and look differently, who share love differently, that we all have a place as part of one community. This is an ethical pursuit, a matter of morality. COVID took so much from us. Over 6 million people. And that's a number we know all too well. We know it's trauma, and we know it's pain. And we also know that the effects of COVID extend beyond the physical loss and suffering. If we continue to watch movies from home, take our coffee to go, get our food delivered, and live with fear of stranger danger, the social distancing we practiced during the pandemic will become an irreversible societal plague. Like Jonah, we will be left self-righteous, angry, and most alarmingly, all alone. We punctuate the new year with the sounding of the shofar. As you know, there are several types of shofar blasts. Of course, there is the tekiah, a regular complete blast, and following the tekiah, there is the shavarim and trua, short broken notes. I imagine that together the blasts from the shofar fill the air with a story, a prescription, really, about how we should live in the new year. First, there is the tekiah, whole and complete. The tekiah represents the full self, rooted in community. But then, as in life, come the challenges of the shavarim and trua, notes of brokenness and disconnection. How do we respond? We recommit to the Tekiah Gedolah, one long, continuous blast. As the shofar blower's face reddens, the meandering notes of the Tekiah Gedolah desperately hang on to one another in succession with unity and with connection. We live in a world where shavarim and trua, loud, broken sounds of isolation, leave more and more people like Jonah living in self-righteous solitude. But today, as we come together here in our synagogue home, we can remember the power of a Beit Knesset, a home of gathering for us all, where by reaching out to one another, we reach up to that which is beyond us all. Like Harold Gilligan, we can claim connection as a sign of moral maturity. And like the sounding of a Tekiah Gedolah, the concluding shofar blast that ushers in the new year, if we redden our faces with effort, we can go beyond the trua and shvarim, disconnected and all alone, finding the spiritual resolve to reach beyond ourselves for the Tekiah Gedolah and the great blessing of connection. Shana Tova.